So let me ask you a question. Have you ever had an overbearing desire to drink blood? Sounds a bit kind of Transylvania-ish. You know, not the kind of thing you expect from a nice Jewish boy or girl. In this week's parasha, we have the prohibition against consuming blood in any form. And that's why in Torah law, there's so many details about the preparation of meat, because before we're allowed to eat the meat, we have to be 100% sure that any blood is completely removed. That's also why we check eggs, because we need to make sure that there's not even the tiniest spot. Even if there's one spot of blood on an egg, the entire egg has to be thrown out. It's not kosher, it has to be thrown out. In medieval times, there was a period in history where Jews were consistently accused of killing Christian children in order to put their blood into the matzahs. It's the most bizarre claim, because there is no other society that goes to such lengths to ensure that we don't consume blood. So it was a bizarre claim, and nevertheless it was a popular one, and it caused tremendous distress and lots of tsuras for the Jewish people over the course of centuries. To the point that even not so long ago in certain Arab countries, the blood libel, as it's called, surfaced as well. So the Torah tells us on a number of occasions that it is forbidden to eat blood. The first time that we're told is already a while back in the book of Vayikra, in the parasha of Acharei Mos. And there the Torah says that you should not eat the blood because hadam hu hanefesh, because blood is the soul of the animal. For very simple reasons, of course. If you remove the blood from an animal, the animal cannot survive. So it's seen therefore as the blood of the soul of the animal. In this week's parasha, where the Torah reiterates the instruction, so this time the Torah says, Rak chazak, you should be strong not to eat blood. So the question is, why does the Torah say you should be strong not to eat blood? Because that's a very unusual expression. There are many things that the Torah tells us that we may not do. And generally speaking, we don't find that the Torah says be strong about it, even though some of them are very attractive. And some of them are very difficult to avoid. Let's say, for example, when the Torah speaks about not speaking badly about other people, there you would expect it to say chazak, because it's very difficult. It kind of comes naturally for people in the course of conversation. You gossip a little bit, you spread a little bit of, did you hear so-and-so, what they did? So you would expect that that's something which is very difficult to do. You'd expect that the Torah would say chazak, that you should be strong about it. Or for example, the Torah tells us that when Hashem introduced all the restrictions on relationships, it says that the people cried because they had come from a society where there were not those restrictions. And it's very difficult. Sometimes a person has a lot of desire for something which the Torah says you're not allowed to do. And it's difficult for a person to overcome that desire. So you'd expect perhaps over there that the Torah would say, chazak, you should be strong. And it doesn't. But here suddenly when it comes to blood, then the Torah says, chazak, you have to be very strong about it. So the question is why? Why does it say chazak? And what's interesting about it is that there are two opinions. And the two opinions at face value seem to be literally from one extreme to the other. First, we have the opinion of a sage called Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says the very fact that the Torah had to say chazak, that you need to be very strong to prevent yourself from eating blood, that tells us that obviously at the time it must have been something that was very common. In fact, he goes so far as to say that they were steeped in eating blood. Shtufin ba'achilas dam. It means it was like a craze. It was this very compelling behavior at the time that people used to eat blood. So that's his view. His view is that because it was so compelling and because it was so attractive, the Torah had to tell us that you need to be very strong to prevent yourself from eating blood. His colleague, Rabbi Shimon ben Azai, takes the exact, or it looks like almost the exact opposite approach. And he says, look at this. When last did you ever have a desire to eat blood? That's not common. It's not common. Okay, there are people who'll tell you that if you want meat to have a really rich taste, the steak must have the blood. Okay. But nobody really talks about, I've got this compelling urge that I need to have blood. So he says, look at this. Can you imagine? That means that it's a mitzvah which is relatively easy to fulfill because you're not naturally attracted to do it, so it's not so difficult to stop yourself. And nevertheless, the Torah says chazak, that you should be very strong and ensure that you don't do this thing. So Reb Shimon ben Azai says it's not because they found it difficult to stop themselves from having blood. On the contrary, he says it's to teach us that if an easy mitzvah you need to be careful about, chazak, you have to be strong to do a mitzvah that is easy to fulfill, how much more so other mitzvahs that are possibly difficult to fulfill, you have to be very strong not to override or not to contravene those mitzvahs. Okay, so those are the two opinions. The difficulty with Rabbi Yehuda's opinion is that if it's true that the Jewish people had at one point in time been, because let's say they lived in Egypt and maybe it was a common thing in Egypt for people to eat blood, so maybe at some point in time they had been steeped in eating blood. This is now 40 years later. This week's parasha is already the next generation. That generation had passed away. So we don't find that in the original instruction, we don't find Moshe telling the Jews, be strong, and now he's suddenly saying, be strong. So that's the reason Rabbi Shimon ben Azai doesn't buy Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. He says, because if it was such a big issue, it should have been brought up originally 40 years ago. And the reason Rabbi Yehuda doesn't like Rabbi Shimon's opinion is because he says, I don't really see why the Torah had to use the word chazak to say, be strong about something that is relatively easy. So sometimes if you want to really appreciate different views on an issue in Torah, when you have two different sages who have different views, and you want to appreciate what's compelled the one to take a particular view and the other one to take a different view, so sometimes it's helpful to step out of the immediate topic and to look at what these two rabbis generally teach. It's what we call the Shita Sam. In other words, you'll find that different rabbis have a shita. They have a particular approach, and they apply that approach to every interpretation that they give to Torah. And that's why there's a certain theme that runs through all of their interpretations. And other rabbis have a different shita. They have a different approach, and therefore you'll find that they have a different theme that runs through all of their interpretations of Torah. So the theme that you find Rabbi Yehuda applies right across the board in all of his interpretation is that he says the original text is the primary concern. Devarim kichsavan. Read what it says, and whatever it says, that should be taken at face value. And that is your starting point of how you interpret the meaning of a verse in Torah. So he says, and he says this in various places throughout the Torah. So you look over here, what is the word that glares at you? Chazak. Be strong. So he says we need to take that word at face value. When do you have to be strong? When something is difficult to do. So therefore, as far as he is concerned, we must be dealing with a case over here where it was difficult for the people to stop themselves from eating blood. Now, it's interesting because the Rebbe, in his analysis of these two opinions, says you have to understand that just because people do something does not necessarily mean they desire it. It's an interesting psychology. In other words, we assumed that when Rabbi Yehuda said that the people were very engaged in eating blood or consuming blood, it was because they loved eating blood. And that's why Rabbi Shimon ben Azai had a protest and said, please, who wants to eat blood? So the Rebbe says it's an interesting psychology that people have, where people are often attracted to do something not because they enjoy it, but because they've been told that it's got some kind of a benefit. So for example, not everybody who goes to gym loves going to gym. So why do you do it? Because they told you that it's healthy. So even though it's painful and even though it's a schlep and sometimes you don't feel like getting out of bed and you don't want to have to go and do all these things, why do you do it? Why are people stuffing? Why are they steeped in gym? Because they've been told the value and the benefits. So it could well be that at that particular point in time, there was a culture that believed that if you had blood, it would make you stronger or it would give you immunity against diseases or whatever it is. So it's quite possible, Rabbi Yehuda says, that the people didn't enjoy having blood, but they had it because there was this pervasive culture that taught that it was actually something helpful and healthy. And therefore they had to be told, Chazak, you got to be very strong to break that trend and not to buy the hype and to do what a Jewish person is supposed to do, not what happens to be popular. And then Rabbi Yehuda's message for us would be exactly that Jews do not follow trends just because they're trendy. We follow what the Torah tells us, regardless of whether it's popular or not. Rabbi Shimon ben Azai's approach, his theme, his shitta, his generalized approach to the whole of Torah, is that he's the one who teaches have a zor b'mitzvah kala k'vachamura, that you should be as cautious about a so-called minor mitzvah as you are about a major mitzvah. Why? And he says, and he also says, uvoreach minha avera, and you should always run from any possible sin, even the smallest, lightest sin. Why? Mitzvah goreres mitzvah v'avera goreres avera. Because the nature of people is that one mitzvah will lead a person to do another mitzvah, and one avera will lead a person to do another avera. So therefore, Rabbi Shimon ben Azai's approach, his theme to the whole of Judaism is that any opportunity that we have to encourage people to be committed, to be invested, to be enthusiastic about their Judaism, we will take that opportunity, because we know that even though what we're pushing the person to do might be something so-called minor, it would be worthwhile because it will start the ball rolling, and that will be the catalyst for them doing other mitzvahs too. So because that's his theme and his approach in Torah, so to him it's quite acceptable that the Torah would take something like not having blood, which is relatively easy to observe, and would say, chazak, be enthusiastic, be on top of it, don't take it lightly, be 100% invested in the observance of this law. Why? Because that will become part of your psychology, that will become part of your habit, that will become how you engage with your Judaism, and one thing will lead to another, and it will actually be the catalyst for more observance in the future. So therefore, Rabbi Shimon ben Azai's view of this particular piece is to teach us that as a rule, any time you have the opportunity to do any mitzvah, never respond to that opportunity by saying, okay, maybe this one's not such a major one, so I don't have to pay it so much attention. Always throw yourself fully into whatever opportunity for Judaism arises, because you never know what that could do for you in terms of your spiritual development. And both opinions obviously have value. And so that's why actually, while they might seem to contradict, they actually dovetail. So Rabbi Yehuda's opinion teaches us about the value of taking things at face value. When the Torah says something, understand that what the Torah is saying is literal. And Rabbi Shimon ben Azai's lesson for us is, and over and above that, use every opportunity that you have in your Judaism as a springboard for greater dedication to come in the future. So those are two perspectives. Perhaps tomorrow, if we have some time, we'll look at why they specifically teach it in the context of blood. So to be continued, please God.